I'm here with Todd Starnes at National Religious Broadcasters talking about his new book, Twilight's Last Gleaming. Todd, thank you so much for being here.
Cheryl, what an honor. I'm a huge fan of yours, so
likewise.
This is like fanboying here. So.
I love your work too. I followed
Thank you
for years, so I'm so excited about your new book because it talks about something that is so near and dear to me, faith in America and how we can recapture Founding Father ideals. So just talk a little bit about it.
So I was reading a speech that Ronald Reagan delivered. I'm a huge Reagan fan, and this speech was a little obscure, but it talked about the national anthem. And Reagan pointed out, made an interesting observation, that our anthem really does not start off with a declarative statement. It asks a series of questions, asking if the flag is still standing, is the flag still there? And I thought about that when you think of another Reagan speech where he talked about how freedom is not passed along in our bloodstream, that every generation has to fight for freedom. And it really does pose an interesting question to us as Americans. Are we doing that? And if not, will the flag still be standing? And so we talk about those issues in the book. I try to do it with a lot of humor, and we try to tackle those issues and really encourage Americans to take a stand.
What's happened since the Reagan years, right? Because when you talk to conservatives, it always goes back to Reagan, and people get that sort of dreamy look in their eyes, right? But we've moved so far from that. What's happened?
Well, we have, and really the issues that were facing Reagan are now facing us again in America. It's almost cyclical, and I think we have to go back really to the 1960s when William F. Buckley Jr. founded what we know now as the modern conservative movement, and the Young America's Foundation, with this idea that this really is a spiritual battle we're facing in our country. Buckley wrote the incredible book God and Man at Yale.
Yes.
And in those books and in the writings of William F. Buckley, we discovered that really this fight is a fight against communism, but it's not a political fight, it's a spiritual fight. And Reagan understood, William F. Buckley understood that, Reagan understood that. And now when you look at what's happening in our nation today, we have watched, they call them leftist, they call them progressives, but in fact they are run-of-the-mill, good old-fashioned communists. So we're fighting this battle once again.
So you understand that, and I understand that as well, but it just seems like we're beating a dead horse when we try and talk about Founding Fathers openly carried their faith into politics. And you have so many people nowadays that say that's not true.
Right. Well, you have to go back to the founding of the country. When the Pilgrims came over here, they weren't talking about economics. They were talking about the freedom of religion.
Right.
They were persecuted people. So the founding of our nation, before the Founding Fathers existed, this was about religious freedom and religious liberty. And when you look at our founding documents, that was the first freedom they actually agreed upon, right? I call that our foundational freedom. Everything else is built on top of that, and we're very unique in the nations of the world to have freedom of religion. So what happens when you start chipping away at the foundation? Well, it starts to crumble, and the country's starting to wobble a little bit because I think we've become unmoored from the basic foundational truths of the country.
So make the connection for those who don't really see how one leads to the other between religious freedom and belief in God and liberty. How do those two things coexist?
It's really a simple concept. In our way of thinking, we believe that our rights come directly from God. That means only God can give, only God can take away, right? But when you look at where we are in the secular humanist world, it's man who gives you the rights. And if man can give you something, man can take it away, which is, and I think our founding fathers wrote eloquently about that in the documents. Now, they may not be, Thomas Jefferson may not have been a Billy Graham evangelist, but he had a deep and abiding faith in God. And that is very clear in his writings and the writings of George Washington, John Adams, who said our Constitution is wholly inadequate for anyone other than a moral and religious people. So again, take God out of the equation and you get chaos in the culture.
So it's such common sense, right? And yet we're in a position in America where to speak like you just did is regarded as radical. How did we get here so quickly? And really more importantly, what do we do? Because I know that's what your book is about.
I think we have to go back to the 1940s and 50s when Ronald Reagan was the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And that was the time when you had the Red Scare and you had McCarthy, who was really doing wild and crazy things, but that doesn't mean there was not a problem.
Right.
And Reagan recognized that in Hollywood, and the concern is that the communists are very shrewd, they're very clever, and they were basically weaving into the movies of the day and the TV shows of the day these communist themes. Now, people may not have known they were communist, but they were slowly being integrated, which is why you had the Blacklist, the Trumbull movie that came out back in the day. So this was a very important thing because it's very devious. Now let's fast forward to the 21st century, where it's not Hollywood doing it, it's our public education system that's doing it. And that's why, and I talk a lot about this in the book, it is imperative that we reclaim our public schools and education system, and we really get control away from Washington and back into the local communities so that we can put a stop to this radical indoctrination that's happening.
So communists are sneaky, right? And
yes.
They plan long-term strategy and so forth. So with that in mind, what do you think the bigger threat is in America, internally or externally?
I think the biggest threat in America is completely internal. And we've heard the teachings, and I don't have the direct quotes, but we're going to be defeated from within. And the idea that the communists will be able to take over without firing a shot. And when you go back to the pandemic, for example, my concern about the pandemic was not the disease itself, it was our reaction as a people. We were willing to give up some of our rights for this idea of feeling safe. Not that we were, we just felt like we were. The shutting down of the churches was a canary in the coal mine for me. When you look at what happened in Germany leading up to the events that led to World War II, when you look at what was happening in Venezuela, the first thing they did was target the churches, and they shut down the churches. And I think the pandemic, the government didn't come right in and say, you've got to close down these churches. They asked the churches to shut down for the better good. And many churches in the country were willing to do that. That's a dangerous thing, because not only were the churches shut down, all of a sudden the churches just became neutralized in the country as far as having influence in the culture itself. And I think that, to me, is a very concerning issue.
Absolutely, I agree completely. And in the churches, now speaking about the churches a little bit more, part of the problem with the churches too is some of this social justice gospel that has seeped in. And I know it's not the first time in America's history, but it's coming at a time where we're under so many threats. So speak to that a little bit.
Cheryl, I call them woke evangelicals.
Yeah, they are.
And they are.
Yeah.
These are typically millennial pastors, and they were really turned off by what they saw coming out of the end of the moral majority era, this politicization of the church itself. And yeah, that is a problem. The churches are not supposed to be political arenas, but churches are supposed to speak truth to the culture. We're supposed to be salt and light. Unfortunately, I would say a lot of churches are on sodium-free diets these days.
Right.
And as a result, I think that the country has suffered. So the issue now is, all right, how do we fix that? How do we find this middle ground where the church and the pastors should be able to talk about these issues from the pulpit? And I think that's going to be a long-term issue that we're going to have to address in this country. Many pastors are just terrified. They don't want to offend people. They don't want to become targets of the cancel culture mob. And these are real concerns that people have. Look, they came after me, I just don't care. But we've got to have some people out there speaking out.
So have you always been this bold and open with your faith as it mixes with politics, or is this a sort of a slow morphing?
I think the clinical term for it is bullheaded, right?
Okay.
I'm stubborn. But I believe in what I believe, and that's not to say that my beliefs have changed on some issues. I think the older I get, I think the more compassionate I've become, maybe a little bit more understanding. but my core beliefs are my core beliefs.
Right.
And, I stand by those, and people can agree with them or disagree, but at least they know this is where I stand on it.
All right, and one last question, Todd. So when you look at the fate of children in America and the turn that you and I read the same polls, right? They're turning from church, turning from belief in God. How is it possible to maintain optimism for America's liberty since the two are so dependent, faith and freedom?
That's a great question. And, we place so much emphasis on taking back Washington when we need to be emphasizing a taking back of our local communities and our local homes. So Ronald Reagan said this, that American greatness doesn't start in Washington, it starts around the supper table, right? This idea of sharing meals together, moms and dads, children, engaging and interacting. And so I think we have to get back to protecting and defending the traditional American family. This is why groups like Black Lives Matter, Antifa, in their founding documents, they talked about this declaring war, fundamentally changing the nuclear family in America. Because if you can break that apart, then the government steps in and becomes mother and father. I remember you talked about hope, you asked about hope. And I am a very hopeful person. My book is about hope, and I do believe that America can be saved. But it's going to require a lot of work. I was reading this great story about Ronald Reagan, and it was in the throes of the Cold War crisis, and there was just a lot of chaos in the world. You might remember back the day after the movie about the Russians nuking America, and people were freaking out.
Right.
It was like crazy.
Right.
So all of that was happening. Reagan's father-in-law, Loyal Davis, who was a renowned neurosurgeon, was dying. And so Reagan sat down in the Oval Office and he asked for some paper, wrote a 4-page handwritten letter to his father-in-law. And in this letter, he talked about how he so admired Mr. Davis's love for his wife and how he tried to emulate that with Nancy. And he said, as great as that love is, I know of a greater love. And then he went on to explain his faith in Christ and his relationship with God, and told Mr. Davis that, I want you to consider, embracing Christianity. And I thought, what a remarkable scene in the throes of all of this chaos in the world, that President Reagan knew that faith was central. That was the defining component to all of this. Faith is the answer. So I think if we can get back to the basics, then I think we are going to be able to answer, yes, the flag is still standing, and yes, the Twilight's, the Twilight's lights are still gleaming.
Twilight's still gleaming. Thank you, Todd Starnes. I want to thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for your work. It's so great to meet you here, too.
Likewise. Thanks,
Thank
Cheryl.
you.